And and before we begin, I would like to thank the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies, as well as the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies Department for co-sponsoring this event. I'd also like to thank the various people in the departments who have helped make this happen, organizing and funding. And I'd also like to thank Professor Marion Katz for helping organize these events and also supporting me as well. So before we begin, I'd just like to talk about the format. So we'll have about a 25-ish minute talk, and then afterwards we will open the floor to questions. And for those of us that are joining us on Zoom, you can just type in your questions into the chat and they will be read aloud by one of the student workers. So with that, I'd like to introduce Travis Zadeh, who's an associate professor of religious studies at Yale University, where he also directs the program in Iranian studies. He has written widely on Islamic intellectual and social history, and his most recent book, Wonders and Rarities, the marvelous book that traveled the world and mapped the cosmos, will be published this winter with Harvard University Press. And today he will be speaking, or he'll be giving a talk titled Stranger Matter, the Weird and Paranormal in Islamic Natural Philosophy.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you for hosting me. It's really an honor to be here. And to be here present in front of all of you in the flesh, and also I guess virtually as well. Put the mic closer. Yeah, is this better? Good, thank you. So I'll try to navigate this hybrid state that we're in. So right, I'm going to talk about this new book of mine and some of the ideas behind it, and give a general sense of what I'm trying to do in this work. And the centerpiece of it is a natural history written by Zakaria Kazvini, who was a judge and a madrasa professor in Iraq, and Wasid, who was of course from Kazvin, but fled the Mongol invasions. The title, the Ajab al-Makhluqat, or gharīb al-Mawjudat, is probably very familiar to many of you here, and it's a work that covers all forms of wonders, natural wonders, and is well known in many ways to our historians and scholars of Islamic history. There are countless copies of it that are preserved, so it had a very long print life once we got into the age of print, but before that in manuscripts. So here are some example of a lithograph from Lucknow, the Nal Kashur edition of 1866, to give you a sense of its longevity. It's translated into Persian and Turkish and Urdu. He also appears to have written a version in Persian itself, which I'm happy to talk about as well, but we know it also in Arabic. And it is a really important index because of its long circulation for a whole host of ideas and for tracking a whole range of sensibilities. As I mentioned, to specialists, particularly art historians, who have done important work on this collection. Kazvini is very, very well known with its rich illustrations of angels, demons, and strange creatures. Few, though, have sought to track the long reception of this work, and in many ways my book does that in a certain sense. It also takes on the life of Kazvini himself and tries to situate his life in the context of the Mongol invasions in the aftermath. And in terms of the reception history, I think the work is particularly interesting with regard to tracking sensibilities and the way in which you could get into a whole developments in science and philosophy before and after the advent of European colonialism. And so colonialism is also part of the book in different ways, in the reaction and engagement with colonialism. Often these works were illuminated, as I mentioned, and they put a quite a deal of emphasis on this emotive valence of astonishment, and foregrounded most prominently in the expression ajaib and gharīb, wonders and rarities. So some of the broader questions that I'm trying to get at is what does it mean to kind of enter into a space of a world where the boundaries are fundamentally unknowable, to a world where through the course of European modernity, those contours really shift in profound ways. and in that sense, there's really no escaping how much our language, this is something I wrestle with in the work, for describing the world before Columbus and Copernicus has been shaped by these contingencies. And in that sense, the kind of specter, as I think about it, of liberty brought by empires and markets makes the prospect of fathoming the difference of the past kind of vexing. And particularly when we're getting into a whole cosmography that's so radically distinct from modern sensibilities. And so the logic of secular reasoning, I find, is designed to question diverse ways of being and knowing that do not end in an obvious division between science and religion, the medieval and the modern, the liberal and the oppressive. And of course, these are not neutral conscriptions or value-free assessments, they're ideological claims. And so what I have found very interesting about Qazvini and the world that he opens up and its wide kind of history is that it's in so many forms a guide to Islamic thought, to forms of thinking and being in the world, both before and after the rise of European colonialism. So in that sense, almost every page of the compendium could confound modern scientific sensibilities and values. It blends together magic and religion and science as a harmonious unity. And these, of course, this trifecta of religion, magic, and science, there's much of the work of modernity is spent kind of calling these out and purifying them as separate. Because when he speaks of high-level philosophy, while delving into all forms of lighthearted play, he showcases an entire apothecary of medicaments to be used for countless occult applications. He's doggedly committed to a geocentric vision of the world, and yet is quick to acknowledge the limits of human knowledge, human kind of capacity to know the world in its totality. And he trades quite seriously in creatures never seen, and all in a paean, you could argue, to God's providential authority. So it's actually in that space of the strange that I'm hoping to get into a little bit more today. As Ibn Sina contends, paintings and sculptures, even of hideous objects or horrifying scenes, if done with artistry and accuracy, could inspire awe through their uncanny capacity to capture reality. Qazvini follows Ibn Sina in countless ways, and he understood that feelings of wonder and perplexity serve as sources of pleasure through intellection and aesthetic appreciation. He begins his compendium with arguably one of the most important discussions of wonder in Islamic thought. And in the vocabulary of wonder, he's also quick to highlight that rarity is not far from sight. These concepts are so tightly bound together, as I said, ajaib of gharīb, that they nearly appear inseparable. And what I'm hoping to do today is actually try to separate them out a little bit more. Of course, they feature prominently in the title, and he offers very interesting definitions of them. And of course, they are related, but he'll stress they're distinct. I think that distinction is something that warrants attention. I should note, to date, most modern scholarship has paid attention to his definition of this concept of ajab and of wonderment. I myself am guilty of that, of kind of privileging the wonder at the expense of the rarity, as it were, the strange. But I think there's a lot to get at just through the way in which gharīb, this category that I'm hoping to explore a little bit more, the way it builds upon a certain kind of epistemology and metaphysics. Of course, wonder has all these interesting corollaries in the Latin West and in the classical tradition. Aristotle, Plato, the argument goes back to Greek antiquity that it is through wonderment that humans come to philosophize, certainly. But what I'm going to suggest in what follows is that, as far as Islamic cosmography is concerned, there's quite a bit to be gained from this category of gharīb. It's central not only for Qazvini, but also for high-level philosophy of the day. And it had come to dominate metaphysics, and medicine, particularly in the wake of Ibn Sina's whole kind of totalizing philosophical system. Notably, gharīb evokes such cognitive and emotive registers as the remote, extraordinary, weird, obscure, peculiar, abnormal, queer, even and curious. The plural form gharāib, the plural form gharāib there kind of evokes objects, as it were, or kind of reified things that you could find in the world at certain instances. Qazwini defines gharīb as every seldom occurring wondrous matter, so wonder gets packed into it, that diverges from customary phenomena. So he gives examples of strange divergences that occur through the influence of powerful souls and celestial forces or elemental bodies, all of which are determined by the power of God. And so to illustrate the point, he lists examples of miracles, saintly and prophetic, soothsayers, prophecies, the power of jinn, the evil eye, innate disposition of certain souls to paranormal mental power or capacity, often associated with Indian sages. So we have divination, we have astrological prognostication, rare astral, meteorological, geological phenomena, as well as comets and meteors, blizzards, so a whole variety of phenomena that we can find in the world. To understand where Qazwini is going, we should know, as I've suggested and hope to argue some more, that his entire definition of gharīb is drawn in the influence and in the shadow of Ibn Sina's metaphysics. Though he doesn't ever explicitly say so, I think it would have been very obvious to his readers he wouldn't have really had to. So without ever directly citing the great masters, he knows that philosophers have established three categories for extraordinary phenomena. These are the al-umur al-ghariba, and so the first one are psychic influences and subsidiary reactions of the faculties of the imagination that occur without any intermediary. So when used for good, they produce prophetic miracles or saintly wonders. When used for ill, they represent the evil, the magic of evil souls. Then there's the second category, which are talismans that function through their connection, form, and shape with the special celestial forces and elemental bodies. And then the third, it's a very interesting category, niranjat, or elemental magic, I've translated as, which produce strange phenomenon through the power of terrestrial bodies, such as how the magnetic stones attract iron. That's a category that deserves perhaps more attention, and I'm happy to talk more about it. So this whole language of umur al-ghariba, the three-tiered division, and the examples given, they all have parallels. They're actually entirely taken from the Isharat of Ibn Sina. This highly concise text circulated widely. It was commented upon extensively. Here we have Fakhruddin al-Razi's commentary. This particular one was copied in a madrasa, likely Madrasa Nizamiya specifically, but likely in Iran. And it was, as I said, very, very well known in a madrasa curriculum. And as I know, Qazwini himself was a madrasa professor, the head of a madrasa, the Sharabiya in Wasit. In this work, Ibn Sina presents in a very concise form the scientific basis for paranormal phenomena. And this includes his general theory of prophecy and miracles. In earlier writings, he develops other ways of dividing up the extraordinary. But in this particular work, he follows that three-form classification of paranormal causation through the power of the soul as a basis for miracles and magic, talismans, and this niranjat or elemental magic. Those are the three categories. And as I said, this is a text that circulates quite widely and was well known. And there's actually many points of entry for, as you read Qazwini, into this text, so that there's lots of echoes of kinds of arguments. His discussion of the evil eye, certainly discussion of prophecy of angels. And indeed, Qazwini himself studied with a scholar named Al-Abhari, who's also very well known, part of this wave of Iranian migrants fleeing the Mongol invasions, who had settled in Mosul. Abhari had read and taught this work, so we know that he transmitted this work, and just as Fakhruddin al-Razi did, as I note, and Nasiruddin Tusi, both leading natural philosophers of the day. Abhari himself appears to have been a student or at least associated with Fakhruddin al-Razi, so it's in this kind of ambit that we're operating. I should note Qazwini, of course, is a Shafi'i Ash'ari. That's going to come into play as we get into the material. So this bond between magic and miracle, presented here as two sides of the same coin, had far-reaching repercussions for the history of Islamic thought, most significant being the legitimization of what scholars today generally refer to as the occult sciences as a scientific field of learning. Razi, for one, in his own treatment of the topic in Al-Sirr al-Maktum, in his commentary, he references his own treatment of this topic that he delves into in greater depth in his compendium of astral magic, the Sir Maktoum. So this is just a copy that circulated early, right after his death in Bukhara. It's a very interesting copy. I'd be happy to talk about it because the history of the occult sciences broadly. In it, he describes in his own words the Muhammad al-Sharifa, the noble hidden or occult sciences, which he refers to as the amazing and terrifying, beneficial and harmful. So there's a lot of power that's to be found in these works. At least they certainly trade in this language of power and of harnessing the unseen in different ways. And importantly for Ibn Sina, what distinguishes the sorcerer from the saint is the individual soul's disposition for good or evil. In this schema, the faculties of the intellect form the natural basis for the capacity of the soul to act directly on other bodies or other souls through a form of paranormal causation, kind of weird action at a distance, if you were to think of it in a kind of modern turn of phrase. But miracles are the complete realization of this, certainly, of this natural capacity within the form of an individual who, through inherent disposition, has attained the highest level of intellectual and spiritual perfection. So this tahdib al-akhlaq certainly gets, as part of this discourse, you can see quite clearly. As a force in nature, such extraordinary powers can be used to achieve both beneficial and harmful results. Razi takes up these arguments to affirm that, of course, the study of magic is entirely licit. It's not the study that's wrong, it's just what do you do with it, that one should, the ethical implications of it that you should be cautious of. So among the examples of extraordinary phenomena, Qazvini offers the case of those with the prodigious capacity to read stars just inherently, throughout any formal study or any kind of accurate observation, just knowing what the stars are going to tell you. So astroloids are not even important here, just merely through a unique influence of the power of the rational soul that guides these individuals, providing insight into unfolding events. This sentiment that nature is itself pregnant with the strange and marvelous proved particularly appealing to theologians who sought a scientific language to account for miracles and magic. And I think it goes some way to explaining the wide appeal of Avicennan metaphysics across sectarian divides in religious communities, Jews, Christians, certainly, that in the Indian context, a whole array of others who would come to engage with Avicennan metaphysics. Moreover, this view of nature also gave further license to what would become, when frequently referred to as al-ulum al-ghariba, the strange, extraordinary paranormal sciences, as they were frequently known. These fields of learning invariably included diverse forms of talismanic magic, so talismans, astral divination, this word niranjat, elemental magic. And these are topics that also featured prominently in collections of natural philosophy, which brings us back to Qazvini. So Qazvini's work is not a book of talismans, although talismans feature prominently in it. It is rather a whole kind of account of the natural world and its metaphysics and the structure of it. One of the guiding principles for this topic of the strange and uncanny is this whole literature on khawas, or unique properties. So here's just examples of ermines and cats, but it's kind of just throughout the entirety of his sections on the minerals, plants, and animals. And indeed, these sections, strangely enough, haven't received as much attention as, say, the monstrous, images of angels and jinn, although I think those deserve lots of attention in their own right. But the bulk of the work is actually kind of, in some sense, much more pedestrian in the sense of material, that are around us, the physical world around us, and how to manipulate it and use it for various ends. And in that regard, I think it's important that the strange, the uncanny, is also something not just remote, but it's also kind of close at hand, or the potential of it. And it has ready analogs, very interesting analogs with books of secrets in Latin West. There's a whole very long tradition of books of secrets to are kind of uncovering, and they're very wide, in the age of printing press, these become immensely popular if you just measure popularity by the distribution of these works in the European context. So I think there's a very obvious kind of shared parallel here. And there's actually lots of parallels that I'm happy to talk about. I'm going to address some of them. But in this regard, and here I'll get into a little bit more into the Niranj, it's very interesting, his treatment of it. He explains that this elemental magic functions through, he gives a couple of explanations, and one of them is that it's activated through the mixture of elemental bodies and ruhani, or spiritual powers. And the art, he explains, was developed by the ancient Chaldeans of Babylon, he says, and who held that angels and demons worked within physical bodies. So like magnets, the reason magnets work is that, this is their theory. He's noting that there's some kind of, really an enchanted material world around us that can be harnessed for various forms. These powers in turn could be manipulated through various combinations, and that's why it's good to think of these Niranjat as elemental magic, because it's really combining like a recipe or a kind of potion, various material kind of substances, these special properties, and unlocking them through their combinations. I should note that this cosmic framework for understanding the material world has profound echoes of ancient Zoroastrian ideas of dualistic forces. So, demons and angels working in physical bodies just sounds really like pre-Islamic Persian or Iranian notions of dualism animating creation. And is a vision of a thoroughly enchanted cosmos, as I was suggesting, where the sublunar realm, where we are, in this terrestrial realm of existence, is intertwined with demonic and angelic forces. It stands in contrast to prevailing medical discourses promoted by the likes of Galen and Ibn Sina, who sought physical explanations behind the unique properties of substances, rather than like physical material explanations, rather than immaterial. If you were to think of angels and jinn as immaterial in some fashion. The term khawas, used throughout the early Arabic medical and philosophical translations, frequently stood in for the Greek discourses, idiotekes, the unique physical qualities or properties that influence other forms of matter. I mean, this is interesting insofar that this is, when we get into Galen and his treatment of this topic of the language of indescribable properties, he uses this language of indescribable properties, so we don't know the exact cause behind it, but the effects are discernible if they cannot be explained, though, by the manifest forces of the humors in their various combinations and mixtures, but could only be known through experience, as Galen would highlight. Of course, in the medieval Latin medical and scholastic writings, this concept is generally translated as qualitates occultae, and thus this is where we get our whole language of the occult sciences and into the Renaissance. It draws right out of this Galenic discourse as it was received in Latin scholasticism. The unseen or occult properties that represented the immediate agent or efficient cause behind a given phenomenon. These were unique forces that were, as I said, beyond perception and can only be witnessed or directly through their effects on substances. And magnets are the classic example. So is amber. Amber is another example as well. The electron in Greek, where gharīb in Arabic, right? As with talismans, Qazwini includes recipes for elemental magic of Niranjat. So he gives us some actual examples of how these would work, and these involve ciphers and incantations. So there's both an incantatory dimension to it, and that has a Zoroastrian element as well, because Niranjat is itself a performance that the narang that is connected to Zoroastrian forms of engaging with the Avesta for kind of occult ends, you could say. Taken together, these strange influences, as Ibn Sina would refer to them, the athar ghariba, can produce effects so amazing that one would judge them to almost be beyond the natural order. So I think that's an interesting turn of phrase, that he sees these as kind of in the natural order, but they're just so amazing. And he also links this to what philosophers refer to as natural magics, tabi'i, so this where the force of love can bind together lovers. This I would be happy to talk about is clearly coming out of an engagement with the likes of Plotinus and the Aeneids. But this has become very Islamicized by the time we get to Qazwini. Here, I just want to turn to this kind of, there's this discussion of Niranjat, I'm sorry. So where we can see an example of one of the visual representation of this material, right? And it has this whole, the sex magic kind of runs throughout it, certainly, and even the erotic kind of component here is noteworthy. So I just wanted to highlight that that we have gharīb in this form of the kind of the paranormal, but then we also get a whole nother array. I'm just going to spend some time here and happy to open it up to broader discussion to this other category of, or other kind of set of associations associated with gharāib, and that's kind of creatures with strange forms and shapes. That is a whole category for Qazwini as well. animals possessing these rare forms. And the language of monstrosity is certainly the language that is how that I think we have available to us in the Latin West and in English today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the limits of that category for understanding this material here. Certainly, the creatures and the stories are strange and many times they're quite horrifying. And I think monstrosity is a fair way of thinking about it. I think that we though lose some of the nuances that's going on in the language of monstrosity though. So the range of conceptual and social mechanisms used to separate and evaluate people in the broad course of Islamic thought did not follow the same contours as later racial and sexual ideologies that indelibly mark the course of modernity. I just want to note that at the onset. But certainly we're in the space of difference making, and when we're in this language of strange and or even bizarre in forms and shapes. Nor were the various techniques of differentiation stable or static over time. Yet you can see quite clearly through this material that broad associations between hierarchical order, this is a cosmos of hierarchy in every form from macrocosm to microcosm. It is self-reflecting of a hierarchical order from the very small to the very high. So these broad associations of hierarchy, skin color, natural disposition, sexual characteristics, orientations, also informed Islamic understandings of diversity. And so while the European category of race is not does not begin to coalesce until the Middle Ages, monstrosity for its part has a very well-established Latin pedigree, and monstrositas, the condition of being monstrous or prodigious. As a category, monstra has a very long history in Latin. It appears alongside prodigia and miracula in a set of associations that we see, for instance, in Pliny the Elder, who developed this throughout the course of his natural history in the treatment of strange creatures at the edges of the inhabitable world. Arabic and Persian also developed a robust tradition on the strange nations that have direct parallels to these discourses in Latin antiquity. So here I can just give you an example. The pygmies battling cranes, right? You know, Aristotle talks about it. It's very old idea of you know, and it's also kind of course, they're so small and cranes would eat them. It almost makes sense to have a story like that. And there's so many that I can, they're everywhere, right? So we have small islanders. They're here, they're off the east coast of Africa, who fight off cranes, right? I could just spend quite a bit of time highlighting the parallels of, I think, you know, there's kind of limits to what that tells us. One thread binding medieval Arabic and Latin discourses comes through the Greek accounts focused on terrata, that's like the wondrous signs or marvels, portents, as well as monstrous and deformed creatures. And in Islamic natural philosophy, there was no single expression for organizing kind of monstrosity as powerful as this ajaib wa gharīb, right? And actually that's interesting, like we don't have, I can talk a little bit more about, there are certainly like stand-ins that we could point to, like that's kind of like monstrous, but the word is gharīb over and over again throughout this material. So it could evoke the monstrous, right, as in the prodigious and grotesque, while also notably, as I just highlighted, conveying the general sense of the miraculous and even the sublime, right? So that kind of move between the monstrous to the sublime. In the astonishing design of God's creation ordered by divine decree. So certainly demons and jinn could inspire horror and fear. I'm not saying these are not horrific, awe-inspiring, you know, entities. So could the mismatched creatures that jump out from illustrated natural histories in Arabic and Persian and Turkish and Urdu. And the emotive allure of rarities, dog-headed people or those whose heads grow on their chests were not merely horrific monstrosities, though. They could also stand as strange signs of the perfectly ordered harmony of creation. In the higher orders of theology, and this is kind of pulling back into the Ash'ari, you know, discourse that perhaps is informing some of this. Muslim authorities were generally quite loath to invest the physical world with forces of evil that could in any way stand apart from or compete with the absolute power of God. And so Qazwini's definition of the Naranj in the locates it with the Chaldeans, the ancient Babylonians, of, you know, I think he's saying that's how they explained it, you know, that there were these evil demons that were operating behind it. But generally, that the association is that these have a kind of physical mechanisms underneath it, not necessarily like the baleful acts of demons per se. That being said, I'd be happy to talk about how dog-headed creatures were often associated, or the margins were often associated with jinn, kind of being cast out in a primal battle at the beginning of time to the edges of the world. So there are clear points of overlap as well. So I don't want to overstate it, but I do feel like there are palpable differences between monstrosity in the Latin West and the category of gharīb. Of course, Ibn Sina famously argues that evil had no essence in itself and should be rather understood as a lack or privation of good. And although frequently debated, this solution wielded a lasting influence. For many, the issue of theodicy or divine justice in the face of evil took on renewed meaning in the course of the Mongol invasions. And I spent a good deal of my book thinking about what did it mean to write a work, a compendium of natural philosophy, in the wake of the Mongol invasions, in a kind of celebration of the ordered nature of the world. When Qazvini himself fled Qazvin when he was a child, he migrated to Mosul, made his way to Wasit. Wasit itself was sacked by the Mongols during his lifetime. He had to flee Wasit only to return. I don't want to overstate the kind of significance of the invasions, but it was in very kind of obvious ways cataclysmic set of events. And it's not hard to see why Qazvini's appeal to the wonders of a divine order and of lasting stability could provide a kind of solid in tumultuous times. To the Ashri point here, that one common response by Ashri theologians was to argue that divine justice remained uncompromised despite the manifold evils found in existence. I should note that like Razi and Ghazali before him, Qazvini was very, very much trained in this tradition of theology. Standard Ashari teaching held that evil had no ontological power that stood up independent for God. Instead, both good and evil occurred through divine decree. Ghazali, of course, famously takes this to its kind of logical conclusion, arguing that not only did good and evil, benefit and harm originate in providence, but that God created the best possible world. This Laysa fil Amkan Abda Mimma Kan formulation, that's very well known. Of course, scholars also know that this formulation is found throughout Galen in the Manaf al-Adat, for instance. You find it several in various forms, and it's fascinating that the title here, just to note it, describes Galen as a worker of wonder, the Mazhar al-Gharīb as well, right? The producer of rarities. And the Galen's imprint is all over Qazvini as well, in addition to the Qanun of Ibn Sina. He cites Galen extensively. And I think the study of this is of course a study of human anatomy, and it's a reflection of kind of the best possible order, like the hand. Oh, amazing, the hand starts with the hand. The hand's amazing. The hand is amazing. And so it has a kind of, this kind of teleological argument, certainly, but also this optimism in that strict definition of the best possible world within it. Of course, expressions of maximal theodicy can continue to exert influence in the development of Islamic thought, and through all these discussions accorded very little space to evil as an independent metaphysical force that could drive the world in any way apart from God's will. So Qazvini asserts, and I'm just going to highlight one of these other points of intersection with the Isharat, that only those who contemplate existence, and this is a move that is very, very old, Ghazali makes it, others make it, of course, before him, only those who contemplate existence are ready to accept the reality of the wondrous. So the wondrous is a kind of a call to contemplate the world around us. The negligent certainly fail to appreciate the marvelous design, and thus they renounce that what they don't comprehend. So part of this is a play on like what's real and what's not real. So wonder is interesting, and the rarity is interesting because it's also a way of thinking about what is, ideologies of truth and of reality. And this is a similar kind of argument that the negligent kind of reject that which they don't understand, that Ibn Sina develops in the Isharat. And he takes this kind of skepticism and he calls it idiocy at the very end of the Isharat. Famously, he counsels restraint for fi tabiyyat ajaib. In nature are wonders, just as the upper and active and lower passive faculties of the soul can produce gharīb, they can produce extraordinary phenomena, going back to his definition of al-umur al-ghariba. So when discussing the strange animals, back to that whole section on what we would readily call monstrosities, So such as the two-headed child born in Khorasan, so there you have that at the bottom there, or chicks found with multiple heads and limbs, or in this case, a bird as well, with a talking bird. The talking bird is delightful, who like has couplets that are like vulgar couplets. So there is play throughout this, certainly. But he quotes, at this moment, he quotes this expression, fi tabi'a ajaib, right? In nature are wonders. And he cites Ibn Sina simply by calling him al-Hakim. He says, as al-Hakim says, that in nature are wonders. And with this last allusion, which points to Ibn Sina's final arguments for philosophical open-mindedness in the face of wonders and rarities, he draws his collection to a close. For my part, I just would like to conclude today by noting that to trace after wonder and rarity through the course of Islamic history is to ford some difficult terrain. In part, it is such treacherous territory because the endless marvels of the Orient became a powerful foil for defining the rationality of Christian Europe. To denaturalize the categories that grant Western modernity its authority while still speaking through the languages that animate it requires a good deal of defamiliarization. In this sense, wonderment offers both an object, this is certainly the object of my book, but also a method, and that's something I tried to pursue as well, a method of historical inquiry. But play and jest, and it's something I'm very interested in the way we write and craft and tell stories, cannot resolve these problems of knowing and being, though they can certainly help reorient them. Diversion and delight may help us to dissent, to differ, to think otherwise in the face of an irreducible aporia, which has made the past both necessary but largely unintelligible to the demands of the present. And for all that is lost in the intelligibility of these past lives to our living world of ideas and sensibilities, so much is to be gained, conjuring up a world now largely forgotten and poorly understood. But what are we to do with all these strange creatures, right? And these questionable tales, the giant birds large enough to carry away elephants, the dragons, the magical spells. The first step is to recognize that wonder and rarity in all measures of science, religion, and enjoyment can found by design. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis, for that wonderful talk. So the floor is open to questions. In person, you just raise your hand, and over Zoom, you can just type your questions in the chat. I know we already have a few, and it will be read out loud for everybody to hear, and Travis will have a chance to answer.
I know there are questions online as well. But...
Oh yeah, I think it's the sort of.
Okay, so maybe this is something that you're, like trying to dissuade us from asking, but like it's so clear how this work, like completely defies modern categories of, religion, science, magic, right? But I guess I wanted to ask, do you see, I mean, is this just an untroubled, sort of unity where all of this is just sort of, like, or are there other categories at work that he is transgressing or synthesizing or pushing back against?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. You're right that this trifecta of magic, religion, science is problematic for us in ways that is not problematic for him. Certainly, he is clearly engaging with a variety of interlocutors in sundry forms. So that this idea that the negligent fail to understand what they don't take time to perceive is actually a really clever flip on Yaqut's language in the Mu'jam al-Buldan. It's a word for word, and Yaqut makes the point like that, don't accuse me of bringing in this foolish material. Only idiots would like really believe it, but I just have to put it in there because if like Zayd lied, wouldn't you like to know how Zayd lied, right? And so Qazwini just like flips it, and he just says. And he actually takes it, it's very clear that it's Ibn Sina behind him, but although he's not citing it, I don't think he needs to, but he flips it and and so it's very, very much, at play, the what's real and what's not real. It's not like it's a entirely settled matter. And indeed he's engaged, and I think so much of the way diversion and enjoyment fits into this is a kind of valve or a kind of to let off this problem of the factual or the real. And so there's a very long tradition of playing with this. So Masudi does it in the Muruj al-Dhahab in interesting ways. I don't think Qazwini is engaging with him in any explicit way, but it's this kind of recognition that there are things that we just can't possibly know. And so the instance, this story of the, oh, I'm sorry, how did I get back? The story of the elephant and the bird, or the shipwrecked sailor, right? Because when he ends this story with saying "Wallahu alam," right? But it's a great story. Did the shipwrecked sailor get off the island through the bird? Of course, this comes into Sinbad later. We know this cycle kind of through Sinbad, and there's a long kind of that it goes into the literary, right? This literary space is fascinating. He's not. I think he trades in what we'd call literature, very, very much so. He's referred to as a master of Arabic and as a kind of adib, very, very explicitly in the title of the work and the frontispiece. So I think that's certainly a prism through which to see it, but he's also very, very, that is fiction and what we'd call fictional, and the kind of just pleasure of these stories. The stories are inherently pleasurable. The paintings are inherently pleasurable as well. But then it gets folded into, I think this what I'm going to say is an Ashri sensibility. That's certainly where he's coming from, of contemplating existence. So Razi's going to take it up, Ghazali's going to take it up, and this is a form of spiritual discipline. And that's the high, actually, in the Hiyat, it's the highest form of spiritual discipline, is to contemplate the natural world. And the natural world is the book of God. And so I think that there's this whole kind of strand of play and of entertaining the outlandish, but it also could be real, and how could we know? And then there's this other form of a high call of metaphysics, of we need to turn to the natural world as a spiritual discipline, as a way of understanding these higher orders as a pious person in the world, of how to be in the world. I think he doesn't resolve it, and I think that's part of the fun for it, that there's that tension always, that God knows best, but I'm going to give you a good tale in the telling. And at the same time, there's so much practical utility throughout it. So it's like a come to omnibus. It'll just do everything. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll go now to Zoom, and I think we'll perhaps alternate between the two. And I'm just going to go in the order in which they were submitted. So Abul Fazl Moshiri asks, or says rather, thank you for your talk. Do you know about the approximate number of manuscripts of the Persian translation of the Ajaib, especially the illuminated manuscripts, and whether there are more translated manuscripts than the original Arabic ones?
Yeah, so this language of the original Arabic is really hard, because just recently, in the last 20, I'd say 15 years, it's a manuscript from Istanbul came out where people kind of turned to it and saw this, where of the Ajab al-Makhluqat that was in Persian, that's probably from Qazwini. And so that we have these two recensions. It wasn't uncommon for authors to write in both Arabic and Persian. And then we get this Persian recension that, let's say, is authorial. And then we have the Arabic tradition. Then there are translations of the Arabic tradition as well. And then the Arabic tradition, this recension, has actually multiple recensions. So he returned, like many authors at this period, returned to the book throughout his life and updated it. So we have three major, arguably four major Arabic recensions. And then this last one here is the one Persis Berlekamp spent a good deal of time in her book on the Munich manuscript, which excuse me, it's housed in Munich, and it's produced in his life in Wasit, where he lived. So the Persian translations multiply. As I said, we have several Persian translations. In India, we have a very prominent one in the Adil Shah court. Many of the ones that I'm highlighting here, this one is an example of this a Persian copy based on Qazwini's earlier Persian recension, but this would be out of the Adil Shah court, for instance. They're numerous. Persis has a good kind of shot at it in her work, Persis Berlekamp, of the illuminated copies. Vivek Gupta as well has just written a dissertation on the Indian reception too. But these are coming from the perspective of art historians, and so they're really only interested in the illuminated versions, and there's many more that are not illuminated as well. So it's vast, but I think it's just a bestseller. I don't think it's exceptional. I think there are a lot of bestsellers in the medieval period, and this is just one of them. Yeah,
great. Thank you. If I may, I have a question as well. That's sort of
Yeah,
Sorry.
no,
Sorry.
but
please.
Have you, maybe this is a silly question, but have you personally attempted any of the incantations?
incantations, no, but Emily Seelove has. I know Emily, a colleague of mine has. Yeah, what's that?
Of course, Emily.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Emily did, and she made. Yeah, she has a whole kind of account of it. She carved out a talisman, and I don't know if and it was like it was a lot of time. It took a lot of time to follow the directions. It's an incredible discipline, and I think that's part of it too. The difficulty of these things. So they're seldomly mastered is the language fine. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, but I should note that there's a whole pharmacological element that's fascinating, right? That if you look at the Hayat al-Hakim, for instance, it's calling for like the burning of opium and other kinds of hallucinogens in like fires. So certainly these would produce. I haven't experimented with that, but they certainly would produce, mind-altering, potentially kind of visionary experiences. And not to just have a simplistic reduction of it into just like these people are getting high. But I think that you also can't ignore the fact that these substances, they're calling for substances that we know are have a variety of effects on the human body. And I should highlight that here I can give you an example of one of these, I think. Yeah, here we go. So here is a mandal. This is another topic I could talk about forever. This is not Qazwini, but Qazwini is very much aware of this world. And this is a very popular world in the sense of we know a lot about this stuff because there's a whole material culture that survives. This is, again, in the Adil Shah court, so in the Deccan in India. But the work itself, this is actually at the heart of Emily Seelove's work on Sakaki. This is from Sakaki's son, and this is to summon the devil's daughter. Here, and she's has a peacock tail, and then this is a party on top of a lion. And the mandal, this is I'm not going to talk about the mandal, but I could. The mandal is both to summon the demons and also to protect yourself from them. And the fire, and that's where you're going to be putting these substances inside the fire, and thus you'd be inhaling the subfumigation. You'd be inhaling them. Kind of passively, probably. Yeah, I don't know if that's the intention, but that certainly would be a result, I would imagine. Yeah. Did that answer? I haven't tried it, right?
But have you not been tempted to? I'm just curious, like if you're reading all of these, emotions and formulae.
So I think they're hysterical. Some of them are just like to the modern sensibilities, like whoa, like rubbing like cat's blood on your forehead will like attract women. I'm like I haven't tried that, but like why would I do that too? But like they're fun to read, right? They're fun to read. Yeah, but that's in that whole very long literature of like Hawass of special properties. You had but then there's another hand. So maybe you had your prerogative. Yeah.
Just building up this question of the sort of the manuscript history, I was curious, do you track sort of the reception history of this text? And I noticed there was marginalia written on the Munich manuscript, and whether or not you've sort of had access to a lot of these manuscripts, and sort of does the reception change, over time and context? And
thank you. So I just gave you like a snapshot of like one entry into the book, and so much of the book looks at how so for instance, this is an image you made. I've seen it's a famous image from the Library of Congress. Here we have that map of the world, right? And this is a very old idea. This is not in one of the early kind of manuscripts at all, but it's a part of this reception history, an old idea of the world on top of a bull, on top of a giant whale, on top of an angel. And of course, as you flip this map around, it has over here the Western Hemisphere in it. It also has. This is not your marginalia. I think this will show you the Western Hemisphere, does it? No. And then it has the wall of Gog and Magog, which is very interesting to me. So that's just an example. This is another one of Qazwini's manuscripts that has something like the Western Hemisphere. If you flip this around, that's Africa, and then that would be the Western Hemisphere. But marginalia. So this is part of the book, like is looking at how Qazwini becomes not just static, but also a repertoire for absorbing new information, right? And new kind of ways of seeing and being in the world, although there is a kind of stability to this text. Certainly it's immediately legible and recognizable in that phrase, ajaib wa gharaib. So part of the book is also looking at its long reception in this kind of Bengal to Balkans complex, as Shahab Ahmed would have it. So in India, as I mentioned, this Adil Shah court translation, that would become a repository for extensive marginalia. And that marginalia will be stable. So you'll see the same set of treaties. So it's not It's not like comments on Qazwini. It's just Qazwini alongside treaties and all these little kinds of treaties that go like, from special properties to sex magic, to recipes for sex magic, to like all the Indian kings that ever existed from the beginning of time. So in that sense, I'm very interested in like what stories we can tell through the history and biography of a book, and how this book opened up ways of imagining both the past and the present that take on a very distinct idiom over in different contexts. So in these marginalia, for instance, you have Dar Shuko's Majma al-Bahrain, selections from the Majma al-Bahrain, where he's engaging with the Upanishads, and it's a whole like Indic cosmography that's radically different than like anything that Qazwini knew, but at the same time, it's entirely legible through kind of the language of natural philosophy. Yeah,
That's it. Thank you.
And then over there, yeah, this whole line there. Yeah.
Just after that, we'll go back to online just to
Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm taking over your role.
It's fine. It's already handed over.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, whoever. Yeah.
Thank you, Travis. That's a fantastic talk. And I just have like two questions. The first, I'm just wondering whether the term takhil and takhayyul, how important is this term?
Heyula, particular, is it Heyula as well, and Hila? No.
Like takhayyul.
Takhil and takhayyul, right?
Yeah.
Production of takhayyul. So
Yeah.
I was wondering whether this term is important for writers of the
Yes. Yeah. So
and what is its epistemic function?
Yeah.
And because, like, for example, in Farabi and Ibn Sina, it has an important epistemic.
No, very much so. I'm sorry. I heard Heyula, because that's his other space where you could think about monstrosity. But you're talking about Takhil, which is the discourse of the imagination.
Right. And the production of that kind of imaginary.
So
right?
this is brilliant. No, and it's thought experiment. Or you have more questions?
I just have one.
I'm so excited.
The way in which you explain the Qazwini's text is that, and also I didn't get the sense of this when we read your wall book.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
We were just
there it
reading
is.
with graduate students, and the sense is that you talk a lot about how many of these authors' understanding of the, for example, the gharīb and etc., is very much informed by the theological view of the world. But I'm just wondering the other direction, right? In that, to what extent is Tales of gharīb, right, actually also looks back into theological debates and shapes? Because, like, for example, Jack Brown's article on how Tales of Karamat, for example, circulating Tales of Karamat actually reshape Ash'ari theology, right? Whether Quranic or non-Quranic. So I'm just wondering whether, to what extent is the gharīb text?
Oh, that's a brilliant. I like that. There's a lot there, and it's like kind of the ground up, version, and I think, and then vice versa.
Right? The dialect.
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted, and there's so many places you could kind of think about that. I think Jahiz would be interesting, certainly in the Hayawan. I mentioned Masudi as well, who are responding to, like, Masudi is out with like Sarafi merchants, and he's, so that's like a reality on the ground who are telling him tales. But he's also, interested in, he is very interested in theological problems as well, though we don't think of him as a theologian. He did write works on fiqh too. And indeed his response about the anqa, which is like the giant bird, is actually a hadith response. And it's about like tawatur, which is fascinating as well. The way that, like, how do we know anything about the world? And that epistemic sense of, like, when it's far removed. And that's a problem, that doesn't just, implicate hadith, it also implicates, ontology in a very, in a very broad sense as well. And so Masudi's language there is fascinating. And I think does come out of, he's very much a seafarer. So why not, from these, like, what can you say of these stories? Because it's like the Bahar, the idea of the ocean, it's like it has no limits about the ajaib in it. You can do whatever you want with the ocean because it has no limits, right? So like you could just keep locating it all over there. And I think that there were real Indian Ocean. The India as a site for it is a topos, certainly, but there were real connections with other people at the ends of the world, so, quote unquote. And that, a tale gets longer in the telling, and then how do you account for it, right? And all these things have, potentially profound theological problems to them. So I think there's, like you said, a kind of an ecosystem of cycling up and down. I think that'll be very productive. The other question about takhil, yes, absolutely. And so what's so fascinating is that this is also a site for thought experiments as well, like the capacity to imagine things that are that couldn't exist in the world, right? And they'll turn, and this is old. So Galen will pick it up, right? He'll reject the whole notion of a senator, is that the word? Yes, like the animal, the source of in a human body. But Ibn Sina will say, it's our ability, like that we can think about takhil through this like ability to imagine things that are just patently untrue. And so, yes, I mean, when Qazwini gets to it, it's fascinating because he'll put it inside the schema of the psyche, of the soul, right, and the capacities of the soul. And so that's a naturalized space and a very logical space for him to talk about it, like the kuwa mutakhayala, in that kind of Abyssinian language that he will have. But he also will say, and he will say this too. It's like that's the capacity that allows you to imagine these absurdities, and then he gives you absurdities that are actually things that he will like say are real creatures, later on. But I don't think because he's like I don't think he sees this as a problem, the ability to imagine like a human and an animal like mixed together. That's something that you could do in the mind, but you couldn't, it wouldn't actually exist in the world. And yet he'll have humans and animals mixed together and say these things are real. And I think that he's not trying to resolve that tension. They're like almost different discourses for him. But in the thought experiments, I think they're very real. And philosophers would back to the Yaqut point, like there is a very strong tradition of skepticism, right? A very, very strong tradition. And I don't want to undersell it. Of course, the Ashri response is like Bula cave, I don't know how or why, but it is, and it just opens it up. And I don't want to just say that there's like a kind of naivete behind it, because I feel like back to that point of like responding to what's going on. There's karamat everywhere, right? If you look at the Athar al-Baqiya of Athar al-Akhbar, what is it? The Qazwini's geography, the Athar al-Bad fil Akhbar or something like that. His work is entirely like filled with saints making wonders everywhere, and I think it's just part of the landscape, that they are responding to. That was a kind of energetic response to your question.
Thank you. And we'll just do two now online just to make sure we have everything.
Yes.
So Alexa Herlins says, "Hi, Professor Zadeh. This is also interesting. Thank you. Can you say a few words about the relationship between magic and miracle for Qazvini, or his predecessors or his readers? And does it track at all with the Latin conversations on the same?"
Ooh, yeah. So the Latin conversations are it's not my specialty, but I've kind of dabbled here and there. I do know that Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Ghazali have an influence in Latin natural philosophy. For instance, the witch's hammer. This is the Malleus Maleficorum, which was used to persecute witches in the High Middle Ages, written in Latin. Quotes from both Ghazali and Ibn Sina on the reality of magic, and actually these kinds of these very texts that Qazwini is engaging with. Qazwini was only known in the Latin West later, in the course of the Renaissance, so his work doesn't have an influence in any direct way in the kind of high scholastic period, but there are certainly similar patterns that are going on. And a scholar like Charles Burnett would be much more equipped to address concretely the patterns of exchange. The Khayat al-Hakim, for instance, as I know Alexa will know, was translated into Latin and circulated in a European context. This is a handbook of practical magic that's filled with this material and very much naturalizes magic as part of and this is just, I think, a late antique idea as well, a very old idea that it's something just part of the physical world. That's just a stab at it. The kind of predecessors to him, it's a very long tradition. So, from the move from al-Baqalani up to Ghazali, there's a lot that happens in Ashri Kalam specifically, where you go, from a certain discourse of magic to this absorption of Abyssinian metaphysics after with the likes of Ghazali, and that's a very different kind of sensibility about these things. Ibn Sina will give this the kind of the framework, the imprimatur of science, that magic is just a part of the natural world. Whereas there's going to be a whole tradition of like Bakalani, particularly where we're going to see, and actually coming out of Halaj, I think the Halaj in that Halajian moment is emblematic of this, of trying to kind of curtail all this as just kind of trickery and deception. And that's a Mu'tazili move as well, to say that this is all just sleight of hand, and there's the Mu'tazila will develop real kind of resistance to magic having any kind of ontological reality. I don't know if that addresses it, Alexa. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. And another one online from Fazad Mahmoutian says, thanks for your thoughts and images. Could you talk about how Ghazvini deals with love magic? Is it a wonder, a miracle, natural, divine, all of the above? And is there similarity with Plato's divine / natural eros?
So I'd referenced Ibn Sina on this, where he talks about kind of natural magic, and he's specifically thinking about love there as like the power, and that has as I kind of intimated, I think the Enneads are behind that. And you really see that in Plotinus, this notion of cosmic sympathy, and of course this whole what we call the Neoplatonic Islamic metaphysics from Al-Kindi to Ibn Sina is very much engaging in different ways with Plotinus, and known as, of course, as the theology of Aristotle. Ghazvini doesn't take it up as a separate field, but a lot of this, as I've noted, a lot of the and it's fascinating, as an index of male anxiety and concern. A lot of the potions are about like impotence and increasing sexual prowess and curtailing women's sexual desire. And so that's a kind of manipulation of the physical world for, and I think could be an index for certain types of desires or actual phenomena, or sets of conditions that people experience. And this book is a cure-all, as it were. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Charles. Phil, you have a question?
Just a quick question. I was wondering about the root gharaba.
Yeah.
I mean, you concentrated on the gharab in my head.
Yeah.
And because you were talking about the Western Hemisphere and some stories in the Arabian Nights, does he discuss the etymology?
No, he doesn't get into it. Yeah.
When have you at least looked at it and seen if there's any
that's fascinating.
there's a correlation between the idea of the West setting the sun?
No, it's brilliant. And in the West, of course, has this unknowable boundary, and that's something that is at play throughout this. That we don't know what's beyond the eternal islands, like the end of the known world. And we don't have like an Eastern version of this, which is interesting, because like the East is often the site for wonders as well.
Right.
That it is the West that gets it. And it's not a Quranic word. It isn't. You get this in like gharīb and hadith, right? That Islam began as a gharīb, and it'll return gharīb, which I think it's very much a kind of apocalyptic sense of it. And then there's a gharīb as a stranger, right? And all these things of like the traveler, there's this sense of being like away, but away in a Western sense. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Thank you. Yeah.
He's not the same Ghazvini who wrote a book as the one who wrote a book on poetics.
No, not that I'm aware of. There are lots of Ghazvinis out there. And it's the Athar al-Bilad fil Akhbar al-Ibarik. I'm just kicking myself on that. But in my energetic response, I just chopped it up. That's another book that he has. So just those two. He did.
It's just interesting that this other Ghazvini wrote a book on poetics. It's the main source of a lot of Har's work on poetics.
Yes.
She looks at wonder.
Yeah, right.
As a sort of aesthetic device.
But
very inventive.
That's right. That's very, very much so. Yeah, no, it's very certainly Laura's work is so groundbreaking around poetics and sensibilities of estrangement, but also of wonder at the through the poetic image, back to this language of takhil as well, and the kinds of emotions that wonder is supposed to, that poetry is supposed to evoke.
Sorry, I forgot the order. I'm just gonna go back online just to hold myself accountable. So Karen Pinto asks, or says, there are hundreds of extant copies of Al-Ghazvini's manuscript, including, sadly, many forgeries. I have images and details of many in the libraries in Istanbul and Europe. Many in US libraries too. Separating out the forgeries from the original copies is quite a challenge. What is unclear is why Al-Ghazvini's manuscript became so popular in the late medieval and early modern period. Why do copies from South Asia continue into the 19th century?
Yeah, and it's not just South Asia, but right, we have them in like Uzbekistan, a 20th century copy, in Turkish, throughout the Ottoman, she alludes to it, but we have the Ottoman reception of this material, and throughout South Asia, throughout Iran, Central Asia. So in the print culture, it's lithographed in Tehran as well. There's that lithograph that I mentioned in the 20th century in Turkish. And I think they take on different meanings in different times. One of the things that there are other compendiums like this, right? And that he's in a sense using Qazwini as a kind of Trojan horse to explore both these other compendiums, but also the world that he opens up. Like that he has a whole book within a world within a book. Like literally, it's kind of in the Ilyas Mohana sense of it, but rather than an encyclopedia, it's like a single book. And unlike the Mamluk encyclopedias that are multiple volumes, and you'd be really hard pressed to get like a whole complete set, you'd be thrilled, because Qazvini just stands alone as a single volume. And I think that's part of its circulation, is that it like promises the whole world, and just like these books of secrets in the Latin West that open up hidden powers, and it's highly mobile. And then he, once it's kind of a feedback loop. Like once you become famous, then other like patrons, other people want to put their name to it. So I mentioned this Adil Shah, translation. He's also kind of affirming his own importance by putting his name to a canonical work as well. And so the circulation of it. I mean, forgeries. I'm not quite sure what she means by it. There are lots of like copies that are that include other material too. That are that it becomes Qazvini alongside the Masudis, the so-called the Akhbar al-Zaman that's ascribed to Masudi, or big portions of Makrizi that get folded into Qazvini because Qazvini doesn't really care about Egypt, and like an Egyptian copy says this is wrong. Here's a big chapter on Egypt, and so is that a forgery? I don't know, but she may mean that there's people. I'm not sure what she means by forgery there, but there are certainly other natural histories that circulate, and then there are. I mean, you can track this text. It's a pretty, although there are multiple recensions, it's a pretty stable text, so it's a Qazvini when you see it, like pretty clearly. So it's there and it's everywhere. And I think it's scholastic. Like it's Avicennan, and that becomes a main dominant metaphysical system, and it's in this classic scholastic order, in the taqsim of the mawjudat, of how the whole kind of created world is divided. So it has a kind of logic to it, but it also plays with that logic in all these fun ways. So I think that it's organized very, very well. Why this particular book? It's organized well. It's written in a metaphysics that's like intelligible, and it is playful. And I think those things together, it was maybe in the right time, in the right place, the kind of happenstance. He dedicates one of these versions to Juwaini, who's this Ilkhanid governor. That's always good. And then we have lots, this is the Juwaini copy, it's not from Juwaini, but it's based upon the Juwaini copy. Produced likely in Mosul in the 1300s, early 1300s. And I think patrons saw this as a form of, what emperor doesn't want to have the whole world in his hand, right? And so there's the imperial, and then there's very much the kind of village level as well, that you get village notables that don't have illuminated copies, but it's such a why are they copying this in Egypt in the 1820s? Why are there like unilluminated copies of this in Egypt at that period? Well, it is a useful reference for everything in the world. It's like right there. It's a standalone reference. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And just before we move to a question, just as a comment that I think speaks to what you had just said, from Vivek Gupta, so the Adil Shah marginalia also has the Miftah As-Surud, an important work on musicology. There's also a treatise on writing in scripts, which is significant, and in dialogue with Qazvini. The Adil Shah He translation also becomes one of the standards that are used in the 19th century copies. The illustrations are the basis for the Naval Kishore lithograph, for instance. And he thanks you for that.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Vivek. What a shout out, and kind of disembodied the hatif, right? The voice from afar. So someone who, like I mentioned, of course, he has a very important work on this topic in the Indian reception as well. And there's important work that's been that he and others have done not only the art historian side, but Perseus's work really opens up so much of the field into the larger kind of metaphysics that are going on. So I'm building upon others here as well. Yeah, the Adil Shah circulation is fascinating. The marginalia that it gets copied and is very stable in certain ways, and how that work has a colonial reception too. It appears in a universal fair in Paris in 1855, I believe, as an emblem of Oriental artistry, alongside a whole tableau. This was in the East India Company's tableau in the Universal Fair of like mannequins and like really like in the Arabian Nights style. Indeed, the like newspapers of the day like wrote about the East India Company's exhibition as a like stepping into this space. I don't know, but like stepping into this like distant world in a beautiful way, but like a kind of orientalized, also deeply problematic way of kind of fashioning the other. And so Qazwini as an emblem for that is fascinating. I don't think he was like showcased. I think he was just like a prop, along the side there. But they had it commissioned in Punjab. The East Indian Company had a very beautiful commission. It's in the British Library right now of this work, and it is the Adil Shah copy, and it has all that marginalia as well. And this is what I think the person who commissioned it, this East India officer, notes, like the Mohammedan savants, think of Qazwini as quite the authority, right, or something to that effect. And so there's a whole tradition as well of taking this work as a foil for, as I mentioned, to Western rationalism, and the entry into it is, from India is fascinating. That this is the point where, not the only point, but a major so many of the texts that make their way into European collections come out of India as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think you may go. Yeah, sorry.
You mentioned that he was teaching at a madrasa.
Yeah.
So do we know if this text becomes like a textbook that is being circulated not only in regional madrasas, but cross-regional?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I'm very interested in this very problem or question or matter of the codicology and the reception in various contexts. So I mentioned the court. This is a courtly, the one behind me clearly, a courtly production or high level production that could afford gilding and illumination in various forms. And then you have much more, as I've noted, much more rough and ready copies that are not as invested in illumination at all. Something that's quite fascinating now that so much of the Istanbul collections are of it, you can go through the diftars, right? There are these catalogs, 19th century catalogs of the Istanbul collections, and all the madrasas in Istanbul have copies, not just one copy, tons of copies. And of course, Damiri's work on animals they go side by side, and Damiri, who's this later figure who writes a work on zoology, copies extensively from Qazwini, and then often in the printed versions of the 19th century in Egypt, Qazwini will be a paratext to, or a kind of a marginal text to Damiri. And these were very common. They're held in madrasas throughout Istanbul. There's, as Karen Pinto alluded to, there are many copies. But I think the madrasa is one site. I don't want to fetishize the madrasa as the only locus for the production and reception outside of a courtly context, but certainly it intersects. In Qazwini was a madrasa professor as well, but sometimes you wonder. Like I note here. This copy, right? It says in the colophon that it's produced in a madrasa nizamiya, and then you're like, oh, that's great, I love that. But what about all the other copies that just they don't care, and they might have been produced in a madrasa, but they just don't reference it as well. And so this is positive, but it's like absence of evidence is an evidence of absence, and there's lots of copies, and you think, well, was that copied? The Wasit copy doesn't it mentions it's copied in Wasit, but he's a madrasa professor. Was it copied in his madrasa? It doesn't say. And it may probably, and we also have stories of him dictating the text in an ijaza form, which also sounds very cool. Like, and there's several of these of that. I received this text from Qazwini as an ijaza, and then I could then transmit it, which is a very kind of different way of imagining how natural history. It's just an interesting way of imagining how work like this might circulate, because it would be also easy just to copy it without any oral form at all. right? Like, was he reading it aloud? You know, these kinds of things. These are just kind of ruminations on a really important question. Thank you.
Lydia?
It's more of a curiosity than a question. And it relates to that last question of takhil. And I wonder if in texts related to science, magic, religion, how do we go from takhil to takwin, from the sort of ethereal to the composition, pharmacopoeia?
Yeah.
Is there like a philosophical path, or like how does it work literally?
Oh, how we go from the realm of kind of the world of images into the kind of takwim, as you said, the composition of a materiality. That's a huge topic. It's a great question. How does say someone like Qazwini go through it? I can tell you that, where he'll tell you how the whole world is organized, and that the Quwa al-Mutakhayla, for instance, is located in the human body. And so he'll talk about the materiality or immateriality of these capacities, and so it'll be, you know, located in a physical form. But then I also hear in your question maybe something even broader, maybe along the lines of poetics of the imaginary, and then the embodiment of that kind of poetics as well. And I just want to also give a shout out to Laura Harp's book, which Phil referenced as here too, that there is this very long tradition of kind of the poetics as a kind of syllogistic form that's supposed to present a type of consent, you know, that you have a proposition in poetry that then produces, you know, consent from the person, the audience. And so that the idea of the imagination, that we're activating it in people, and that in actually not only activating that power, and that we're then getting new knowledge from it, right? The syllogism is to produce knowledge, right? Like you have these propositions and then new knowledge is generated from it. So that's that's still maybe in the world of ideas, but it's also through other people. And going to that idea of like spooky action at a distance or whatnot, that there is this, very much in Abyssinian kind of metaphysics is how do we explain what he's going to talk about is this paranormal actions on other bodies, right? That at a distance, and he starts with imagine this back to this idea of the takhil. Imagine this is a very famous thought experiment. Like you're on a bridge and you're walking on a bridge. You like freak out if you're on a high bridge, like a high plank, and you are walking over it. But if you were to walk on that same distance on the ground, your body would be fine. And it's precisely because of the imagination that then activates this fear on the body. And then he uses that as the basis to explain how like miracles happen, because it's the same power that the soul has to shake your body up when you're high on a height. Like if I were to walk on a high building on the edge of it, like, you know, but if I were to just do that right here, it would be very, very simple. And it's actually, that passage is in this Malleus Maleficorum that I mentioned. So these thought experiments are really easy to transmit. I'm transmitting it to you now, thousands of years later. It's really easy to remember it. And of course, you know, it is in the Malleus Maleficorum when they're persecuting witches, like this is why witchcraft works. It's why it's real. It has an ontology to it, which is not what Ibn Sina wanted to say, I don't think. I mean, it's fascinating. This is me just riffing, but why aren't there the persecution of witches? You know, why? I mean, we don't have it in a widespread phenomenon. There are accounts here and there, but nothing like systematic. And I'm wondering if there is a kind of metaphysics of like, well, witchcraft isn't so bad. It's just what it is, you know? And so that's kind of a play with your question, but thank you. It's a great question.
And I think this might be our final question online. And I think you've sort of touched on this a little bit indirectly and sometimes directly, but from Jessin Ing, thank you for this richly illustrated talk. Could you say more about how being a Shafi'i Ash'ari shaped Qazwini's work in terms of his framing of the work or his choice of marvels or rarities?
Yeah. So I believe it starts with like azma, like it's like God, like pray, like to the azma. It starts with this word azma, to, you know, the majesty of God at the opening, which actually comes right out of Abhari in one of his, like it's like the Khulasat al-Khulas or something to that effect. It's one of his distillations of Abhari's metaphysics. Abhari was his teacher, who was a Shafi'i Asharite. And so even the opening, I think that opening, you know, the Tahmid can tell you a lot about one's orientation. He never states it, but I think this is clearly a kind of quoting from his master in the very kind of opening benediction. He repeats a widely kind of cited hadith that, you know, there's Mujaddid every century. And this Mujaddid, you know, starts from, you know, all the major Shafi figures and Ash'ari figures appear in his list. So, you know, it's got Shafi, it's got Ghazali, it ends with Razi, and so the Mujaddid comes every year as a hadith, and people, you can tell, like there's different versions, and they often will tell you something about one's sensibilities. So that's just in the kind of explicit noting here, where you can see it really concretely. But I also think the whole kind of theological sensibility, he will be quoting the Ihya without ever saying it. This idea of contemplating the world as a pious activity of this like tahdhib al-nafs or tahdhib al-akhlaq, that he'll cite Ghazali, word for, again, never quoting him, but it's clearly that's a text that's very important for him. And by this point, I should highlight that although Ibn Sina is not a Ash'ari or a Shafi, his metaphysics had been absorbed by the likes of Ghazali and reimagined and criticized, but also largely appropriated in the whole generation into Fakhruddin al-Razi. Of course, my colleague Frank Griffel has done a lot of work on this. But there's an imprint throughout. I think the issue of theodicy is there. This issue of evil, certainly. I think the citations of Razi, even he'll cite the Sir al-Maktoum as well, which is really rich. This work of astral magic. He clearly is aware of it. And, yeah, it's a great. I think it's very. If you just read it with a close eye, it just smacks of it. And then, of course, in the Tabaqat literature, he's known as all his teachers, as I said. So if you go into the prosopographical literature, it's like that's the network that he's in. And he was appointed to teach in a madrasa as like a Shafi madrasa too. So I mean, all those things are telltale signs. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Any final questions? Well,
thank you.
Travis.
Thank you, Antonio, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.